Alright guys, we got an 86 944 turbo here. Hey guys, today we're going to be looking at this 1986 944 turbo. The owner brought it over because he said it had low oil pressure and wanted us to check it out. This video is from a few years ago, but I'm glad that I held on to the footage because even though we restore these cars, this ended up being one of the largest projects that we've ever had. And so I hope you enjoy it. So today I'm going to be putting this car up on ramps and we're going to be checking the OPRV. Alright, so it's up on ramps now and we're going to be taking a look at this OPRV. It does appear to be the early style. So as I was removing the OPRV, I noticed that the warning light on the sender was removed and zip tied back out of the way. I'll try and get that back on, but as for now, the sleeve that is in there seems to be in there fairly tight and the housing's lined up. So what I'm going to try and do here is, since all this looks good, I'm just going to try another OPRV and see what that does. Here's the OPRV that was in here. Everything looks good and the housing's all lined up, so the only thing I know to do is try another one and see what happens. Got a new OPRV in now, so let's give this a try. Looks like we have less oil pressure. So maybe I'll try one more and then we'll have to start looking elsewhere. So I've got the mechanical oil gauge on here now and we're going to check the pressure with it. Go ahead and start it up. Alright, so I just put another sender in there just to see what would happen. And of course it's also reading 3 bar. My mechanical gauge is reading 3 bar, but I'm still not exactly convinced that it's not an issue with the OPRV. Alright, so we've ruled out the sender. The only thing left to rule out is the OPRV, and this is what's going to do it. If I start the car up and we still have 3 bar oil pressure, then the next thing I'll check is the front crank bolt. Alright, so I guess we can rule out the OPRV now. TJ's over here breaking everything down so that way we can go in and check the crank bolt and the tension on the belts. So the tension looks good on both belts, but if you look at this roller here, you can see that it is nowhere near the belt. So I'm going to have to go in and snug that up, and hopefully that'll get rid of some of the noise that's coming from the belt. But right now I'm going to go ahead and get the starter off so that way we can get the flywheel lock on and try torquing down the front crank bolt. TJ installing the flywheel lock. So we got the flywheel lock on and I was able to check the torque on the bolt and it was exactly 155 foot-pounds. And I also got up underneath and made sure that the washer was in place, and it is, so there's not really much else we can check here. I've already tested as many OPRVs as possible and I put the mechanical gauge on here. So there's not really much else to look at here. I guess it's time to start thinking about tearing into the bottom of this block. So what I think we're going to do is go ahead and pull the belts and make sure that the washer is in there right, and that isn't the issue. I would really hate to take this entire car apart only to find out that it was something simple. So we're just going to take our time with this and try and figure it out. So we didn't see anything down in there, but we went ahead and cleaned everything up and we're going to try torquing it back down now. Alright, everything's cleaned up and torqued back down when we started up, and the oil pressure's still at 3 bar. I guess it's time to go in there and check the pickup tube and the rod bearings. Alright, so we got everything back together and fired it up, and unfortunately we still only have 3 bar oil pressure, so I guess tomorrow we're going to start installing these rod bearings here. Ruled out the OPRV. I tried swapping in about 5 different ones and they all gave similar readings, and then I put a mechanical gauge on here to rule out any electrical gremlins. Last night we went in and checked the washer, the sprocket, and the front crank bolt. All of that was just fine, and we still didn't get 5 bar oil pressure. So today we're going to start breaking this thing down and get in there and change the rod bearings. So TJ's got the oil drain now and we don't see any metal in it, but we're going to go ahead and drop this and check the rod bearings anyway. So he's got the crossover pipes unbolted from the header on this side, and now we're removing the intake so that way we can gain access to the turbo over here. Alright, so we got the intake off now, and these vacuum lines are in terrible condition. You can see here just some of the examples, but let me take you around and show you. As you can see here, this pipe right here is not original, so it was bent up and connected to the intake like that, in which it was crimped off, and so no airflow is getting through. Right here at the water net, you can see that this rubber hose has been utterly destroyed, so we're going to have to get that out and replace it. Over here at the Venturi, this was not plugged in whatsoever. Over here at the cycling valve, you can see that some of the connectors broke off, so they decided to use those white ones, but they weren't sealed, so, you know, of course, that was more than likely leaking boost, but didn't matter anyway because the wastegate was probably not working, because here's the hose of the wastegate and it was never connected. And worse than that, when you plug it in, you can just pull it right back off. Nobody even bothered to tighten this down. And of course, it's also got one of those white connectors in it that just pulls straight out. So we've got to get a new cycling valve in here. We've got to get rid of all these old vacuum hoses and get the right stuff put on here. And then once that's done, this car should run a whole lot better. We've got the crossover pipe off now, so the next thing we're going to do is get this car up so we can remove the cross member. Okay, so today we're getting this car raised up so we can remove the cross member. And then we're going to get the engine supported so we can remove that oil pan. Moving the cross member now. We've got the cross member off now. So here's what the oil looks like. There's no metal, but there are tiny little particles of RTV. So right now we're going to get the rod bearings out and replace those. We're going to dump this oil and clean everything out, and we'll just go from there. So we got the rod bearings pulled now, and as you can see, they don't look that bad. I'm not sure that these are the issue, but we're going to go ahead and replace them anyway. Old bearings out, new bearings ready to go in. We got the rod bearings in last night. Today we're going to clean out this oil pan and reinstall the oil pickup tube. You can see that the seal that came off the oil pickup tube was in pretty good shape, but we got a new one that's going on. We have the oil pickup tube reinstalled with a new seal, and TJ's over there hosing out the oil pan. We've got the oil pan all cleaned up now, and we got a new gasket going on. We've got the oil pan back on with the brand new gasket. Next we'll install the cross member and the crossover pipe. Alright, we got the cross member back on, so next we'll go ahead and remove the chain. Alright, we got some new hoses going on. We're also going to replace this pipe since it was in pretty bad condition and it had a bunch of holes in it. All right guys, we got the cross member in now. Today we're going to be installing the crossover pipe, and down here we've got all our new seals. So we're installing the crossover pipe, and unfortunately I wasn't able to install it with this pipe in the way, so I took it off and I was going to put it back on, but unfortunately these studs here were also in the way, so I went to remove them and one snapped off. So I was hoping to save myself from having to remove the wastegate, but now that this is broken off, looks like I'm going to have to pull it and take it to the machine shop and get that drilled out. All right, I got the stud out, and it's kind of good that I did remove this because, as you can see, this seal is broken and there's a lot of exhaust residue, so this thing must have been leaking pretty badly. So I'm removing this seal, and as you can see, it appears to be cut here. So I'm thinking what they did was take one of these larger seals and then cut it down to make it fit in here, and that's not going to work because that's not going to hold pressure if it's not tight. All right, I've got all new seals here, and I've got a new stud. All right, the wastegate's back on with a new seal. The only studs I could find at the hardware store were a little longer, but it's going to be just fine. TJ's finishing up underneath now, and the only thing left to do is get these vacuum lines on once they come in. So I've got the Venturi all sealed up, and I have the hose connected now. Over in this bag we got all new vacuum lines to clean up some of this mess. You can also see where someone deleted the T here. So we're going to put this one on and get rid of some of these old rubber hoses and use the factory correct plastic ones. Alright, so we have the intake and the fuel rail back on, and we also replaced a lot of these vacuum lines. Many of them weren't connected whatsoever. Right now we've got to get this balance shaft belt on and then get the spark plug wires back on, and then we can fire this car up and hopefully we can get it home this week. We have the belts back on now, so TJ's installing the covers. Alright, we got the air box on, and next we're filling the oil. Well guys, we've got this engine back together now, and while it sounds great, it unfortunately still has terrible oil pressure. So we essentially have two options here. One, we can pull the engine and try rebuilding it on the stand, which is going to take forever. Or the second option, which I'm sort of leaning towards, and that is just finding a known good engine that we can test drive beforehand and swap it in here and just be done with it. So anyway, I think that's what we're going to do. Unfortunately, when I started this car up this morning to move it onto the ramp so that way we could get this engine out of here, the clutch pedal fell to the floor, so it looks like we're going to have to fix a few more things before we can even get in there and pull the engine. Alright, so Patrick's out here today removing everything so that way we can drop the engine. Alright, he's almost got this car broken down enough to where we can start chaining it up and drop it out of there. Alright, so TJ's got the engine completely disconnected, so the next thing we're going to do is drop it out. Alright, we've got the engine out now. TJ's breaking this engine down. So TJ has this engine broken down now. Next, I'm going to remove the pressure plate and get it on the stand. Alright, this morning we're going to get this engine on the stand and hopefully get to the bottom of why it doesn't have any oil pressure. Alright, we've got it on the stand now with the rod caps removed. You can see the RTV that's smeared around through here. What I'm thinking is that this here isn't sealing as well as it should, so we're going to get this girdle off next and we'll check the crank and everything. Alright, we're getting ready to pull the crank now. So far the main journals look to be in pretty good condition, but once we get this out, we're going to measure everything and see where to go from there. Alright, we got the crank out now, and as you can see the main bearings look pretty good. Over here you can see where they sealed this with RTV, and I'm thinking that this wasn't sealed all that well, and this is another reason why you do not want to use RTV. All this stuff just breaks off and gets in the oil, and it can clog up passages and cause all sorts of issues. You may remember when we pulled the oil pan, there's just tons of this stuff down in it. And this could be the issue here. If this has clogged the oil cooler, then we're gonna have a big problem on our hands. Over here you can see all the RTV that's on the girdle. Again, it was just slathered on, and I don't think it was sealing very well. A lot of this was breaking off and getting into the oil. They also resealed the balance shaft housings with this RTV, so we're gonna have to go back and redo those as well. So we got all that RTV removed. Next, we're gonna wipe down the bearings and try measuring everything with the plastic gauge. Plastic gauge is on. I've already measured the rod journals, so this time I'm only measuring the main journals. All right. Okay, looks like the plastic gauge stuck to the bearings here. So I've been looking over this block all day, and I can't find anything wrong with it whatsoever. This engine looks really good. It's been rebuilt. It's got all new bearings in it already, but if you look at the crank here, while it is within spec, those numbers aren't as good as I'd normally like to see. So that's got me thinking that maybe this engine suffered some sort of failure, and that's why it was rebuilt. And while they were in there, they may have turned the crank a little bit. Although I don't think it's enough to cause the issues that we're having. Going back to the RTV, as I mentioned, there was a lot of it in the oil, so it had to have been coming between the pickup tube and the oil pump here. And if it sucked any of that out and caused a leak, even as small as a pinhole, that could cause the issues. So that's the only thing that I can really think of right now, but I would really hate to put this engine all the way back together only to still have those issues. But so far, I'm just not seeing anything. All right guys, so I spoke with the owner and he gave me a little more history on this engine. So I had assumed that he bought the car with it in this condition, but it turns out he could actually pinpoint exactly when this happened. So he said before this, the car was running perfectly and had great oil pressure. So a few years ago, he took this car to a mechanic to have the clutch replaced, and they talked him into having the engine rebuilt while he was there, which he thought was a good idea at the time. And that's when all the problems came up. So that leads me to believe that, in fact, the RTV was causing that issue. So we're gonna seal this up and get it back together. And before we put it back in the car, so we don't waste our time, we're actually gonna test it on the stand to make sure we got good oil pressure. But before I can do all that, I actually have to get these pistons out tonight. I don't know if you can see that, but they honed these cylinders with a stone. And so I've got to get it out and get some sun in, AN30 compound put on these cylinder walls to get them cleaned up. I have the pistons removed now. And you can't feel any of these scratches with your fingernails. So these cylinders should clean up pretty well, but these guys didn't have any business in here working on this engine. And as you can see, they did not offset the rings whatsoever. This is exactly how I pulled it out of the block. All right, so I've got the cylinders honed now. So next I'll go ahead and start cleaning up the compound. I have the cylinders cleaned out now and they look fantastic. So the next thing I'm going to do is get the pistons put back in. I've got the pistons back in now, so next I'll install the crank. Crank's in now, so next I'll get the 574 out and we'll get the girdle on. 574 is applied, so next we're going to get this girdle on. Everything is torqued down now, so next I'll get the rod caps back on. I've got the oil pump and the pickup tube back on now. Everything's sealed up with 574. And I even replaced the O-ring right here at the pickup tube, so everything should be sealed up nice and tight now. Alright, we got the oil pan back on, so next we're going to roll it over and put the balance shaft caps on. Alright, so we just got the balance shaft cover back on here, and I noticed that the shaft had a little bit of play in it before, but I didn't really pay it any attention until we got it all the way back on here, and this is just excessive. So what we're going to do is take this back off and check the bearing. If you go over here, I have another engine on the stand, and as you can see, this balance shaft doesn't have any play in it whatsoever. We got it taken apart again, and as you can see, the bearings are completely wiped out. What we're thinking happened was that they didn't get this lined up here and ended up crimping it so it couldn't tighten down all the way, and it just ended up taking the bearing out. Alright, the new bearings have arrived, and we've already got this shaft in now, and as you can see, there is almost no play in here. We're also going to be doing this other balance shaft bearing, since as you can see, this moves around too much as well. So this one's now perfect. We're going to get the cover back on, and then we'll do the other balance shaft. Alright guys, I thought I'd give you a better idea of what's going on here. This is an early 944 balance shaft housing, and as you can see, the bearing is integrated into the housing itself. However, in 1986, they decided to go with this setup, and the cover is just that, a cover, and the bearing actually sat in this bridge like this. So when we removed the cover on that engine to remove the RTV, because we didn't want any of this stuff breaking off and getting inside our freshly rebuilt engine, we didn't take this off, which was a bad mistake. But once we'd get it all back together, we noticed that the balance shaft was way too sloppy. And so we took everything back apart, and we got in there and found that the bearing was not seated in there correctly and that they had worn out. Now in 1987, of course, they went back to the original design with the integrated bearing. So if we were working on any one of these engines, we would have caught that right away. However, on this one, we just didn't think about it. And there is a lot of oil pressure in here. And so this is where it was all going and why this car had low oil pressure. And this is not necessarily easy to find either, because this was the lower balance shaft, and the only way to get the housing or the cover off on the lower balance shaft is to remove the motor mount. So we would have had to pull the engine anyway. And there's no way to tell with the engine in the car, because once the cap is on there, the balance shaft is going to behave normally. The only way to know that it was doing that was to actually pretty much pull the engine and then go in there and find that. Now that we have the new balance shaft bearings in, next thing we're going to do is install a new head gasket. And we got a new set right here.
Good run of motor. By the time you crank it up, let it get warm, she should clean.
All right. Perfect.
Snug right up.
All right, we got some new lifters in today, so we're going to be installing this cam tower. All right, we got the cam tower back on, so the next thing we're going to do is get it down on the ground and start putting the clutch assembly and the belts on. All right guys, we got the engine back together now. We're next going to put it on the ground so that way we can put the clutch assembly on. Then we're going to rotate it over and make sure we got good oil pressure. Got her back down on the floor now. So next we're going to get the clutch assembly on. Got the flywheel on there now, so next we'll install the pressure plate. Alright, this engine's coming together now. We're getting ready to try and turn it over here in just a few minutes. Next thing we need to do is get the clutch fork on and the bell housing. Then I've got a starter here that we're going to be using. Alright guys, we've got the engine back together. What we're going to do is just turn it over to see if we have oil pressure. So as you can see, we've got the OPRV and the mechanical gauge on here. Bell housing's back on. You can see the mechanical gauge right here. You also have a starter in here. So this is how it's going to be wired up. We have the ground on the side of the bell housing there, and then we're going to take this and put it on the positive, and the positive on the battery is already connected. Then when we go to start it, since we have a jumper wire there, all we need to do is touch this ground right there, and this engine should turn over. So I think we're ready to do that, so let's see what happens. Okay, so it's not getting a good enough ground perhaps. All right guys, we got it figured out. We tried a different starter, but it was just me not thinking. Actually, I needed to have a heavier gauge wire on here. So you can see what we did with the jumper cables. We doubled them up. Then we used a 1 gauge wire here for the negative, which is grounded to the block. And we were able to turn the engine over. Hope you guys are ready for this. Perfect oil pressure now. So this car, or this engine rather, is ready to go back in this car. All right guys, we got the engine ready to go back in now. Engine is now back in. All we got to do is get it mounted up now. All right, we've got the steering rack, the AC compressor, and the balance shaft belt on. Next, we'll install the belt covers and try and get the radiator installed. We've got the steering rack in now. Unfortunately, this tie rod end over here is completely shot, while the one on the other side is brand new. So as you can see, this car is coming together. Today we got the other tie rod in, which matches the new one that they replaced on the passenger side. Once that's on, we'll get the starter, the reference sensors, and the intake on, and then we should be ready to start this car up. All right, they're getting the wheel off, so they're going to place that tie rod in. There's the old tie rod end, and this is the new one. Alright guys, we got the wastegate seals here. We replaced these when we took it off the first time, but they didn't survive the second round, so we're going to put some new ones on here, and hopefully we can get this car started up. Alright guys, we got her off the ramps and fired up. Everything looks pretty good. We do need to repair the sensor wiring back here, and number one wasn't working, and when I tugged on the wire, just came completely out, so I just went ahead and twisted one on for now. I'll get all this soldered up tomorrow, but as for tonight, this car is running. I'm going to take you inside and fire it up for you. And at last we have 5 bar oil pressure. TJ's over here removing the clusters so that way we can replace the odometer gear. TJ's got everything back together now. One day I'm going to try and make a video on reinstalling a new gear, but today we just had to get this done. Alright guys, we got an alignment after replacing that tie rod end, and we've also got the oil change now, so next we're going to take her out on her first test drive. As you can see, we have good oil pressure and the odometer is working. Alright guys, this car is now running beautifully. So that's just about going to do it for this video. If you'd like to stay up to date with some of the projects we're working on around the shop, be sure to join me on Facebook. Also join our group, because over there you can share pictures of your own car and I'd love to see them. I'm also on Instagram, and don't forget about Patreon, because without those guys over there, these videos would not be possible, and I want to thank them all again. So anyway guys, that's going to do it. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.